So I'm about to start to sew the new pattern Blair Skirt by True Bias. I like their everyday clothing patterns, and I thought I would tell you how I quickly do put together the pattern when I print it off on my home printer. Firstly, I take all of the pages, there is 49 of them, and in stacks of 5 or 6 I just cut off one side along the cut line, and then I start forming the first row. And now what I'll do is I'll go along and I'll cut off all this bottom row straight across, and I'll just keep doing that, working my way across and then cut off the whole bottom, across and then cut off the whole bottom. I was going to time myself just to see how long it took me to do this. So I will, just so viewers have an idea, it's probably be about half an hour. So here I've just cut along the whole bottom, and now I'll start adding my second row. And when I cut off the one side, I do just take a stack of 5 or 6, and at the same time I just kind of click them together, make sure they're all roughly together, and I just cut the one side. So I don't do it individually, I do it as a group, and it makes this process go much faster. So I'm just getting my pattern prepared. There is about 49 pages to tape together. You can do it in different sections. The actual skirt part is before page 22, so that's a different section. That's the top section. Bottom section here are all the interfacings, waistbands, etc. Make sure when you're looking at your pattern that you have the right sizes of different parts that you're cutting out. So for example, with the waistband, there's a 0 to 8 waistband and a 10 to 18 waistband. So make sure that you're tracing or cutting out the right one. I personally don't even bother with cutting out button placements, simply because once I have made a garment, I just put the buttons where I want them to be. And again, with the pockets, it's the same thing. Make sure that you're cutting out the correct size. So there's only one pocket flap, so per sizing group. So this one, for example, is sizes 0 to 6. So just double check that you're cutting out the right sections. And my view of my skirt is going to be slightly different in that I like a little bit more of an A-line skirt. This is pretty straight, and she does say that once you purchase the pattern. From the pictures, I thought it was slightly more A-line. So I am going to take from the hip, I am going to draw a line out just a little bit more to make it slightly more A-line, and that's the only modification that I'm going to make to the pattern. And for those wondering how I have made this more of an A-line skirt rather than a straight skirt, this is the original line right here, the size 4 line. This is the side seam, and I simply, from about the cut, lengthen, shorten line, I've just drawn a straight line out to the size 14 line. So I'm just adding a couple, about 2 inches on the side seam, because what happens if you go out too much is you get a bunch of fabric just on the side seams, but not in the middle as well. And I want it to be evenly spread. So I've only added about 2 inches on the side seam. And then parallel to the grain line, which is this one, I've drawn a line 3 inches to the side here in red, and another one 3 inches to that. And I've started at the cut, lengthen, shorten line and drawn it parallel all the way down to the bottom of the skirt. And what I'm going to be doing is cutting this along these lines and opening up the skirt by about 1 inch. and that's going to help to spread the fullness throughout the front skirt. I haven't messed at all with the center front seam or grain lines because I know there's going to be a button placket there. I want to keep it nice and parallel to my body. So I've just done this more towards going towards the outer body. And I'm going to do the exact same procedure on the back skirt. So I have cut most of the pattern pieces on the fold of the fabric with the fabric wrong side up. Remember that your belt loop and your waistband will be cut on the single layer, not on the fold. And please excuse my waistband. This is the one I use for all pants and skirts. I just know that it fits me. And another thing I have done to help with pattern recognition is I have labeled all the pattern pieces with much bigger lettering. I find it's really hard at a glance to read this and see what everything is. So I've just gone ahead with a marker and marked everything in to make it nice and clear. And that's my other tip. Also, another tip I have is if you are making this into a denim skirt and you like that ready-to-wear look of a lot of top stitching, kind of street style, jean style, I have not cut my back piece on the fold. I've actually drawn in a seam allowance. This is where the fold line is in black, and in green I drew in a 1/2 inch seam allowance because I do want a center back seam. Otherwise, I think the back might look a little bit too plain for the style of skirt, relaxed casual skirt that I'm looking for, almost like, yeah, street style. So I will be adding a center back seam and top stitching it. And as well, that does give a little bit of leeway for fitting if you do have that back seam. So something to think about. And I can't remember if I've mentioned I have widened my skirt slightly. That's why the pattern piece looks different. And another thing that I would like to mention, before you cut out your waistband, there is another option. You can certainly cut your waistband out in one full strip. The other option would be to think about putting a center back seam in the waistband. That will give you the ability to fit the waistband if you happen to need to take it in a little bit, almost like a dart, or it's slightly too big, or in the future you want to take it in or let it out just a little bit. I know most men's trousers have that feature. It just gives the garment a longer life, and anything that gives you fitting ability to me is wonderful. And if you make a belt, that center back seam will be covered by the belt. If you do what I'm doing and do a center back seam in the middle of the skirt, the center back seam of the waistband will just be a continuation, and it will look like it was intentional. So that is something to consider with cutting the waistband. Also, this skirt has a few darts to sew. This skirt is not meant for absolute beginners. I assume that you know how to cut a pattern out. But to do it quickly for darts, what I like to do is just cut the top of the dart legs into the fabric and then take a pin and just mark where it is on the, where that start of the dart is on the fabric. And then you can just kind of eyeball in a straight line, or I do use carbon paper as well to transfer the marks. My other suggestion as well, whenever you're cutting a waistband, whether that's a curved waistband like this or a straight waistband like in the pattern, is just to add an inch or two on either end. That does give you lots of leeway if you need to make the waistband slightly bigger. You can always cut it off. The first step is with your waistband, make sure you mark which is the top and which is the bottom after you've interfaced your pieces, and make sure you put the notches in. If you're like me and you're putting a center back seam into your waistband, after you've interfaced your pieces, you will want, the dark side is my right side, you will want to sew that right sides together. And if you're going to bother doing that, I'd give yourself a good 1/2 inch to inch seam allowance, and I wouldn't bother finishing these edges. So at a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch, you can just sew straight up and down after you've applied your interfacing. So after applying interfacing and cutting out all your pieces, you're putting a center back seam in your waistband, you should have sewn that. So right sides together and press it flat. And it really doesn't add that much bulk. You will really want to make sure that you've labeled your pieces well. The back and the front look fairly similar in size, so I always just use painter's tape and label my pieces. If you haven't already, you should have stay stitched along the top edges of the skirt on the front and the back to stop it from stretching out. Be sewing your darts, so right sides together. I like to start at the top, back stitch, and slowly make my way to the point. And I shorten my stitch length as I get closer to the dart, and then I just tie off my tails by hand. And as tempting as it is to skip the step of pressing your darts, it's very important to press your darts open so that they just lie nicely. And one little tip I have about ironing darts is to find on your ham where the end of the dart fits, and then give everything a little bit of steam. And that's going to help to shape the dart even before you get your iron on there. And then my other tip is to let it cool down on the ham. So don't just take it away quickly. Give it a few minutes to cool. You can go do something else in the meantime, but that's going to allow the fabric to cool off and form into its shape. And I know I'm working with a really dark denim, so it's really hard to see, but here is my dart, and you can see there's no puckering at the edge at all when you let everything cool and you give it a bit of steam to start. You can have a perfectly formed dart in a matter of minutes. And I did forget to say that I'm pressing my dart towards center back. So you can see that I have now finished my darts and finished this center back seam that I've added to the pattern. And if you like, now is the time to go ahead and top stitch this center back seam. You can either top stitch it onto one side or top stitch with 2 rows of seaming, or 2 rows of top stitching on either side of the seam, or 2 rows on one side, however you want to do it. Next, we'll be working on our pockets. If you haven't already done so, transfer your 4 circle marks to the wrong side of the fabric. This is my wrong side. I'm going to be folding my pocket in half, and then from the top edge, I'm going to sew down to the first dot, back stitch, and then from the first dot to the second dot, I will be doing a basting stitch, and then from the second dot, I will back stitch again and sew down, and then we're going to press. So again, start off, back stitch, sew to the first dot, back stitch, baste from the first dot to the second dot, back stitch, and then sew all the way to the bottom, back stitch. When you have done this sewing line, you should be pressing it so that the sewing line is in the center and you have a rectangle like this. The next step is taking your pressed iron, main fashion fabric face up with your lining piece face down, so right sides together, and we're going to be matching our notches, and we're going to be sewing around we're going to sew around all around the edges except for leaving a gap of 3 inches or so. So you'll start, you'll sew, pivot, sew around here, pivot, sew up to here, pivot, sew across here, pivot, and sew down to about here and back stitch, and all at 1/2 inch seam allowance, or 1.5 centimeters. And just a little tip when you're sewing these pockets is you do want your seam allowances to be quite exact so that the pocket turns out to be nice and square. If you're coming up to your edge and you see that it's not going to be quite on, you may have to make your stitch length less so that when you turn your fabric, it is right on that 1/2 inch. So I was going at a stitch length of 2.4, and then I lessened it down to a stitch length of 2 so I could hit that edge so it would be exactly 1/2 inch as I continue on. And you kind of have to play with it like that on each side. So you can see I've started here, I've stitched all around, pivoted, stitched around this side, pivoted, stitched all the way over here, pivoted, stitched this side, pivoted, and then ended right here. Here's my gap. And now, next what I'm going to do is cut off my corners so I can lessen the bulk. I'll do that to all my corners. And I will trim down this seam allowance as well by 1/2. So I will take it and just trim it down. So I'm going to do that to each pocket, and then you've probably guessed we're going to turn it inside out and iron it. The trick to all of this is actually it's going to rely on the ironing a lot. You can really kind of manipulate the shape and get it to be exactly as you want. And before you're finished completely ironing, you're going to put one on top of the other and make sure that they're quite similar in the same size. Another tip when sewing the pockets is to make sure where you leave that gap opening is not where the pleat is. So if I turn it this way, you can see I've started here and sewn all the way around and stopped here. I didn't do that over the pleat. I didn't leave the gap. So that's just a little tip. And you can see with my finished one, you can see how close I've come to the corners with cutting the extra seam allowance off. And that's going to help me to turn this right side out and get crisp corners. And then you want to press your pocket to the right side. So I have never been great at turning nice sharp corners, but I kind of cheat a little bit. So what you want to do when you're ironing is you want to roll that seam over so that you do see your main fabric all along each edge so that your lining doesn't show from the front. And what you can do is you see I have this corner that's kind of rounded. You can take a little pin and just kind of pull it out a bit. And don't worry about it too much. You don't want to stretch it because when we top stitch this, that's what your eye is going to be attracted to, is the top stitching. So if it's not quite perfect, oh well, neither is life. So just know that your top stitching can kind of trick the eye here. So the next tip I have is to take your pocket and make sure that your pocket bottom and your flap are the exact same width from one side to the other. You can see here my flap is just slightly shorter in width than my pocket bag. So I need to go back in and just shorten this up just a little bit on either side, because the last thing you want is to sew your pocket bag on and then realize that things aren't lining up perfectly. So my advice is, before sewing on your pocket bag to the skirt, is get the whole pocket assembly finished and make sure that it lines up. Once you've done that, and my other piece of advice, by the way, is to, for these flaps, you can just shape everything by hand first and then iron it, and that makes it easy. The next step is drawing in your line for your buttonhole and sewing in your buttonhole. I won't go into detail about that because every machine is different. But I will say, I think she calls for 3/4 inch buttons or 1.9 centimeters. And I unfortunately don't have my buttons for this skirt yet, but I have drawn in the length of line that I need with my crossbars to guide me. So I will stop for there because I need to finish off my pockets. And again, what I mean is that the width of the pocket flap is the exact same as the width of the pocket. That's what you're checking before you sew it onto the skirt. And my other suggestion when you're sewing the pocket the buttonhole, is if you're a little hesitant to do it in your top stitching color thread, is to do it in a color that matches your main fabric, and you'll still have top stitching along the outside, so it will still look fine. But if you do it in the same color as your main fabric, it will hide any imperfections, and to do it in a lighter thread, your top stitching thread, of course, will be probably a heavier top stitching thread. Once you've checked that your flap and your pockets match in width and everything looks good, and you've sewn your buttonhole, what you can do is now apply it to the skirt front, apply the pocket bag. You're going to be applying it to the side that has the closest to the center front, the straight line here, and you should have transferred your markings from the main pattern. And so all you're going to do is put it on those markings. Don't worry that the seam of the pocket doesn't line up with the dart. That's okay, because your flap is going to go over top, and you will be unpicking this later. So what you're going to do is you're going to pin it into place and then sew from one top corner down, across, pivot, and back up. And you're going to be top stitching that. So as close to the edge as you can. You can do 0.3 millimeters up to 0.5 millimeters, or 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch, whatever suits your fancy there. And you can do go slowly so it looks nice and neat. And after pinning my bottom part of the pocket on, I was looking at this straight edge here. I haven't unpicked it yet because I want to do that when the skirt is finished. And it seemed a little bit crooked. So my advice is, this is supposed to be a straight line, almost like center front. And my advice is just to measure the bottom of the pocket from there and the top of the pocket and align it so it's straight along the straight edge here. Otherwise, I think it'll be noticeable if not. So here is my pocket flap, and I'm going to attach it to the top of the pocket bag. Some of you may be wondering what to do with this raw unfinished edge, but actually what's going to happen is you're going to sew it across with the pocket flap face up, and then we're going to be turning it over, and then you're going to be sewing it across again, and that's going to hide the seam. So if you've sewn it across once, fold it over and then sew it across, and that will hide the raw edges inside the seam that you've made. So once you have put your pocket against the markings from the pattern, I also measured it from the edge of the pocket to the edge of the straight line here. You can top stitch starting on the top right hand side, and you're going to top stitch down, pivot, across, pivot, back up, pivot. And your top stitching can be anywhere from about 2 millimeters to 5 millimeters, or anywhere within 1/4 of an inch along the seam. And this is what I mean when I say the top stitching is going to trick the eye into making that pocket look really nice and sharp. My corners aren't perfect. That is just something I seem to can't do perfectly, but with the top stitching, it kind of corrects that. And when you're top stitching, lots of people don't like to back stitch because it does kind of make the stitches look slightly more bulky. You can just start stitching, and with your tails, take a needle at the very end and pull them through and knot them on the back side. The next step is marking 1/2 inch from the top edge of your pocket, and you're going to be sewing the flap facing up, right sides together. You're going to pin along that edge and sew at about 2 or 3 millimeters, or 1/8 of an inch from one side to the other. So you can see here, I have moved my needle all the way to the far edge of my foot so I can sew very, very close to this raw edge. So I've sewn close to the raw edge, but when I turned it over, I realized I didn't quite catch it. So just do a quick check, and you can always go back and just sew in a little bit deeper, which is what I'm going to do. And then once you have sewn across the bottom edge, then you can hand press your flap down and just make sure that the top stitching lines up on either side. No one's going to know if you move this pocket flap a little bit, and then iron it when it is all lined up. And there's nobody going to check to see if it's perfectly straight, sewed perfectly there. All your eye is going to see is the edges and the top stitching. So make sure those edges are aligned, and then we will be sewing across the top here at a 1/2 an inch seam allowance so that this seam is enclosed. And again, before starting my second pocket, I'm just going to make sure that the edge of my pocket is equidistant from this raw edge here, which it is, and then I'll sew my second pocket the same way I sewed the first one. So after you've finished off your pockets, the next step will be attaching your back to your fronts on the side seams. I am just basting my side seam all the way down because I might want to go back in and adjust it once I get the button band on. Then I'll kind of see how everything lies. And this is before putting the waistband on. So I like to just baste my side seams. So sew right sides together, the front to the back. So you should have sewn your fronts to your backs at your side seam. I have simply basted my side seam. You can go ahead and you can finish the raw edges if you like. You can serge them. I tend to serge my raw edges separately, not as one. So I'll serge this side and then I'll serge the other side. And that's because I like to have the ability to adjust it if I want. Because every pattern, although if you make an item multiple times, if the fabric is different, it will fit different. And once you're finished sewing the side seams, you should have something that looks like this. The next step we're going to do is go ahead and finish your hem. So you're going to turn it up 1/2 an inch, and then you're going to turn it up 1 inch. And pressing at 1/2 an inch and pressing again at 1 inch, and then top stitching. I'll show you on mine as I go. So I've marked in chalk at a 1/2 inch, and I do like to mark from the right side, or on the right side I should say. so that when I turn it over to start to press this up, I can actually see quite easily. So when I turn this up, I can see my mark, which you may not be able to see on camera, but there it is. And so I will be turning this up 1/2 inch and then 1 inch. Next up, we're going to start working on the button band that goes on either side. So you're going to take your piece, and this long piece, it should be interfaced. So I've marked in chalk at 1/2 inch, and I do like to mark from the right side, or on the right side, I should say, so that when I turn it over to start to press this up, I can actually see quite easily. So when I turn this up, I can see my mark, which you may not be able to see on camera, but there it is. And so I will be turning this up 1/2 inch and then 1 inch. So you should have folded and pressed up the bottom hem, and now you can go ahead and top stitch that. I actually do like to top stitch my hems from the front side, but there's no hard and fast rules about that. And it would be good if you had a walking foot to use, because you do have a few layers in here. I will be using a very heavy needle and my walking foot just because this is heavy denim. So your hem should be sewn, and now we're going to go to the button band. So your button band is pattern piece number 4, and if you look closely you will see that one side does not have notches and one side does have notches. The side that does not have the notches is the front of the skirt. It is also the side that is not interfaced. So from the middle to here, it shouldn't be interfaced. I made a mistake and I interfaced the entire part of my band, but just ignore that part. The first step is to be taking your band and you're going to fold it wrong sides together. And you're going to press along that halfway mark all the way on the long edge from top to bottom. So first things first is pressing this long edge. Once you've pressed this along the long edge, you're going to open up your button band and you're going to press it in towards the wrong side on one side, the unnotched side, at 1/2 inch, and it will be actually right along the edge of your interfacing. So you're just going to turn it to the wrong side and press again. And this unnotched side is going to be your front. And because I'm like to stay organized, I just put in marker front so I know which is the front. Now we're going to go on the unironed side and we're going to apply it to the front of the skirt. So we're going to have the right side of the band facing the wrong side of the skirt. I'll show you that. So here is my front of the skirt, obviously, my button band, and I have the right side of my button band and I'm putting it to the wrong side of that center front of the skirt, matching my notches and pinning. And I will be sewing this at 1/2 inch, 1.5 centimeters. So once that is done, I will meet you back here. So again, sewing at 1/2 inch. Of note, your button band is going to be slightly longer than your skirt. That's totally okay. I actually cut mine even a little bit longer, but this will be cut off. So don't worry, it is supposed to be longer. So here I am sewing my button band on and at 1/2 inch, which would be just inside your interfacing. And you can sew this at a 3 stitch length. It's going to be sewn again as well. So the next step is ironing the button band towards the button band, and you want to iron it from the underside to get a nice crisp edge here. So you can see that I'm just pressing that seam allowance towards the exterior, towards the button band. all the way. You can give a little steam, make sure it's nice and flat. And the next step is dealing with this bulky seam here. So you have two layers, the actual skirt and then the button band layer, and you want to grade that. And usually there is a slight rule with grading that the outside, the one that's going to be closest to what other people see, is longer than the inside. So this one, I'm going to grade down to about 1/8 of an inch, and this one I'll grade down to 1/4 of an inch. And what I mean by that is that I'm simply just cutting it quite close to the seam line. And then this one I'll cut just a little bit longer than that other one. So it's like a step. So you can see that this one, when I turn it that way, you can see one is shorter. One is shorter than the other. The other way to do it, the quick way, which is what I normally do, is I just use my pinking shears and go right up, which is what I'm going to do now. And as tempting as it is to skip the grading, please don't, because it's going to be hard to sew the buttonholes. And the grading just helps to give more kind of free area to work in with those buttonholes that we'll be sewing later. So next we're going to work on the bottom part of the button band. Again, this is the inside of my skirt. So we're actually going to fold this button band right sides together and pin. And we want to sew right at the edge of your hem. We want to sew a straight line right across here. And this is going to finish the bottom edge of that button band. And you want to make sure that you end right at the start. You want to make sure your stitching is right at the bottom of that hemline so it's continuous. So you can see I'm going to sew the bottom of my button band. I'm not catching the folded part in. I'm just going right to the edge of the interfacing. I can always tuck that folded edge in later. But what I am making sure is I'm aligning it to the bottom edge. So we've sewn that, and now it's time to just neaten that up. So we're gonna cut that, and we're going to trim this corner down to make it easier to turn. And now we'll be turning that right side out, and you can kind of play with that to make sure that you have a nice neat turn there. So I'm going to just play with this and iron it and make sure I'm more interested in what it looks like from the front side. So you can straighten that out. To make turning easier, I've actually, I'm going to go in and cut off this excess. I had unintentionally left a lot of that bulk there and didn't realize it. So I just unpicked that, and that will make things much easier to turn to the right. So I will get that done and poke out my corners. So I had a little trouble just getting this nice and straight. Next time I would leave a little more length, and you can always do some hand sewing there. After you've finished your bottom, turning it the right way out and poking out your corner, as you've guessed, the next step is simply covering your seam line with the button band. So just putting it right over the edge of the seam. And if you feel that you haven't been that accurate, you can always just take a ruler and just measure from the bottom and again at the top and make sure that band is 1.5 inches. Now, because this front button panel is the main feature of the skirt with the pockets, I really suggest getting it right. So measuring to make sure it's straight and equidistant across, as well as if you want, you can do what I've done, is I've actually just sewn with a basting stitch along this first line here in this matching thread color, so that when I do top stitch, I know that it's right, and I won't even have to remove my basting stitches because it matches the denim so closely. So that is an idea if you want to baste it down first. And if you're sewing along, there's a lot of layers here, and you find that the fabric is kind of bubbling up a bit because the top part is not feeding as fast as the bottom part, and you constantly have what almost is going to look like a pucker. What you can do is use a pencil or a pen, and as you're sewing, just keep prodding that fabric along and helping it out, and that will help you with that bubble that likes to form sometime. My walking foot or a walking foot would totally alleviate that problem. So again, you can see that I've basted this down on this inner edge, and I did have a little area here that went a little bigger than I wanted it to. So now I've gone ahead and I have measured all along to make sure that it's all fairly accurate. The reason I'm a bit of a stickler about this is because I am top stitching with white thread, so it's going to be really evident if I am sticking to 0.5 millimeters away from the edge. You know, if I go in just a few millimeters, it will be evident. So I do think this front panel has to be pretty close to as good as you can get it. Other areas, it doesn't matter. But for this, so now I am sure that it's right. Now I can go ahead and top stitch. And this inner seam is bulky, so it may kind of kick your needle and foot around a little bit, more so than sewing this one. So make sure that the way to avoid that is go super slow and have full control. Use your hands, but this is a part where going fast is not going to help you. Go nice and slow, and that will help with that process. And then when it comes to the end of my top stitching threads, I do bring them through to the wrong side and just kind of bury them off somewhere, wherever. And remember, like my attitude towards sewing is every project I want to learn something, and I want to do everything to the best that I can. But you know, perfection, if you're looking for perfection, that's going to slow you down and paralyze you sometimes. So you want to top stitch and yeah, make it look the best that you can, do your best, and don't move on to the next part of the skirt or the next part of the project until you're happy with the part that you've just finished, because the chances of going back and redoing it are either really high because you just keep looking at it and it bothers you, and then you take more time opening it up and going back in, or you're just not going to wear the garment. So be happy with the step that you're in before proceeding to the next step, but don't let perfection paralyze you and not get it finished. And here's a perfect example of things not being quite perfect. I actually cut too much fabric off, so I couldn't straighten this out after I realized that it wasn't. But there's nothing I can do about it. Really, from the front, is anyone going to notice? Maybe, but who cares? Honestly, everything is not going to be totally perfect. It's okay. Life isn't perfect. So you should have your button bands completely done, aside from sewing the buttonholes. We'll do that after the skirt is constructed. Next up, we're going to work on the belt holders, which is this small thin piece here. And you're going to go ahead and finish one side, either by serging or with a zigzag stitch, just one side. So as you can see, I have finished one long side with a serger, or however you want to finish your raw edges. And then the next step is folding in the unfinished edge by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch to the wrong side. So folding this edge in by 1 centimeter, we'll press that. So here we have folded it in by 1 centimeter. Basically, it's just touching the serged edge, if that's what you've done. And then you're going to fold that in, and then you're going to take the finished edge and just fold it up on top. And then you can pin or clip in place all the way along. And we'll be sewing this on the right side on both long edges, top stitching it. So this is what you should have so far. You should have your finished edge, your unfinished edge folded in, and this folded on top. And I have pressed it. There is another little peek at that. And then I have pressed it. And now what we're going to do is go ahead and we are going to top stitch right along the edge here and along the edge on both long edges. Go ahead and top stitch. So this is what you should have when you're finished your top stitching. And I have made jeans on my home domestic machine. I know top stitching can be a bit of a struggle. So some tips on that is you can take a mallet or hammer and kind of hammer the bigger sections, thicker, bulkier sections down. I've done that before. And you shouldn't try to reverse when you're top stitching. That just can cause a nest and cause a mess. As well, you use top stitching thread on the needle, but you use regular thread in the bobbin. So those are just some tips. Don't hate me, but I now have an industrial machine and it just flies through this. So I'm loving it. So now we'll be cutting this belt carrier into 3.5 inch sections. So you'll have six separate 3.5 inch belt holders. And this is what you'll have, is 6 3.5 inch pieces. And then we're going to take each piece and we're going to fold one end up by 1/2 inch and press it to the wrong side. So before going any further with the waistband, I suggest taking your skirt and actually just giving it a try on to make sure it is how you want it to fit. Like I can see mine already is too big, so I'm going to start to take it in on the side seams. So I suggest getting the skirt to fit first and then continuing on with the waistband. So if you find you do need to take your skirt in, one way I like to do it is you can bring in the skirt a little bit more at the darts, but if you want to bring it at the side seam and get it even, what I like to do is pin the edges together and then stick a pin right through both sides. It's not showing up here. Sorry. And that way you know that you've taken both sides in evenly from the same spot. So that's how I do it. I'm sure there's many ways to do that. And if you're not quite following the video and you have made your waistband a little bit longer like I am, you can always just put it on just to see where to put the belt carrier holders. So after you've ironed up that top of the waistband carriers, what you're going to do is take your lining. This is the right side of the lining, and you're going to put the carriers to the right side. So right side to right side, and you're going to baste at the top of the carriers around 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, and you're just basting the top of them. And what I did to get the placement that I wanted is I simply wrapped the belt or the waistband around me to see where I wanted to put the belt carriers. As well, just a gentle reminder that my waistband looks slightly different. I have a curved waistband. I've replaced it with what was in the pattern, which is a straight waistband. In the pattern, your waistband has one edge without notches, and that's the top edge. The long edge with notches is the bottom edge. So you want this edge, no notches, the top edge, and that's where you're going to baste the belt loop holders on. The next step is taking your main fashion fabric waistband, and we're going to press up the bottom edge by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. So we're just turning it up and pressing at 3/8 of an inch. So you should have ironed your bottom edge of your main fashion fabric waistband up. The next step is we're going to be putting these two together, right sides together. This is the right side of my lining. There's my name tag. So right sides together with the belt loops sandwiched in between. So we'll be pinning the top edge and sewing. So this is what you should have, and you'll be stitching that at 1/2 inch. So you've now sewn this at the top, and now it's time to grade this seam. So cut away the extra seam allowance all across. So the next step is opening up our waistband, and we're going to press the seam allowance towards the lining. Once you have the whole waistband pressed, what we will be doing is understitching. So we're going to sew a line right on top. We want to hit the seam, but we're going to sew a line of stitching right close to this seam to keep the lining where it needs to be. So a few millimeters away from the seam. So you can see here I'm about to understitch, and my needle is right over as far as I can to the side if you're able to move your needle, and I will be sewing just inside the seam. So here is my understitching. The next step is we're going to be sewing the lining to the skirt. So the next step of the waistband is we are going to be sewing the top of the waistband lining to the skirt. So we're going to have the right side of the lining to the wrong side of the skirt. So once I get that pinned up, I'll show you. So as you can see, I have the right side of the waistband to the wrong side of the skirt. Make sure that your side seams are pointing towards the back, and your waistband will extend beyond the button band. That's on purpose. Mine extends more because I like to give myself more length to play with. So the top of the waistband lining, right side to the wrong side of the skirt. Let's sew that up at 1/2 inch or 1.5 centimeters. So this is what you should have when you've sewn that lining to the top of your waistband or the top of your skirt. And what we are going to do next is press this seam that you just sewed up towards the lining. So we're going to press up towards the lining, and I will be back. So you should have pressed your lining and seam up towards the waistband. You can probably guess the next step. We are going to fold the waistband right side to the lining right side, folding up that upper edge here, and this should just extend a little bit past your seam line. So what we're going to be doing is sewing right on the edge here, just like you finished the button band below. We are going to be sewing, continuing your edge. We are going to sew up like that. You can even use a ruler if you want to mark in the straight edge. So we'll be sewing the end of the waistband. And now that you've sewn that waistband, of course, the next step is going to be cutting that off, cutting close to the corner. And we'll be folding that right sides out and pressing. So as soon as I get that pressed, I will be back. So once you've sewn this edge seam and cut off the excess and turned it around, one thing you want to check before going any further is that when you fold that in, when you place one waistband over the other exactly along the button band, that they're both the same width, that one isn't way bigger than the other. You want to make sure they line up from this edge to this edge, which mine pretty much do. So when I put my button band one over top of the other, it all lines up. Once you're finished with that, what you can do is turn in your edge here. Now, I will say traditionally on waistbands, I've always graded this seam. She's not calling for that in her pattern, so we're just going to skip that, but normally I would grade this seam. But yeah, next step now, after you've pressed your seam here, is you are going to take your belt loops and get those out of the way and simply turn in your seam and pin it down just underneath the seam that you just made on the waistband. You're just going to tuck that in, pin it all the way around. So this is what it looks like when it's all pinned around. Sometimes I think for this particular step, the more pins you use, the better. You can also, if you're really fanatical, you can also take a measuring tape and just make sure your folded under edge is all the same all the way around the waistband. So now, starting from the center back, is what she recommends. You're going to do this all in one go. So you're going to start at the center back at the top, and you're going to come around, sew all the way around the top, pivot, sew down, sew all the way around the bottom, come back up on this side, sew at the top, and then sew around the bottom, or sew around the top all the way to center back. So you can do that all in one go, so there's no stopping and starting. She has a very good demonstration of that in her instructions. So starting at the center back and working your way around. So here I am starting at my center back, and I'll be sewing along the edge all the way around the waistband. And I will be pivoting at my corners and pivoting at this corner and continuing on. And if your waistband has stretched out at all along the folded edge, you may have some easing that you have to do. You can see how this is a little loose, so I will have to ease this in. So the next step in your waistband is taking your belt carriers, and they've been folded under 1/2 inch, and extending them to below the waist seam, pinning them, and then we're going to sew them down. I think they're very hard to pin because of all the layers. You may just kind of have to do your best there. But that is the next step. And making sure they're flat and straight. So the next step is going to be sewing the bottom of the belt loops. And once you have them pinned, just go back and forth a few times just to make sure that they are secure. So after sewing the bottom of your belt loops on, the next step is putting in all your buttonholes. The buttonhole on the waist goes horizontally, and you're going to want to make sure that everything is lined up right in the middle for your buttonholes. So what I like to do is fold my waistband over and kind of finger press that crease so I know exactly this is where I want my buttonhole to go. And the pattern has provided buttonhole placements. If you want to do your own and space them out however you want, that's totally great. And again, I just like, you can either fold this in half or measure it to put your buttonholes. In the pattern, she has the buttonholes going vertically down the button band and horizontally at the waist. So when figuring out the spacing for your buttons, I note that if you use her button guide, which is great, I like to fold it in half so I can kind of see my placement. And I like my button to be in the middle of my band and then one right underneath it to keep that area over the tummy very closed up. And then you can just follow her button band placement all the way down and mark each button on your band. So your buttonholes should all be sewn, and now you can go and slice them open and put some fray check on. And how I line up my buttonholes is I place the panel, one panel over top of the other, and I simply put a pin through the buttonhole and mark the button placement on the other side. So I've pinned the panel over top of each other so that everything is in line. And for my own fitting purposes, I took it in an extra inch at the top, stopping about halfway down the pocket.